For me, episode 2 is really about what it's like to conceive of a game versus actually making one. You have this idea in your head of this place. It doesn't exist yet. It undergoes countless revisions. New people come in and they change that vision in some way by what they add or remove. And you kind of just hope and pray that those visions don't compete. They just add to each other. They complement one another. Or maybe they do compete, and that's okay. What you're left with, in all likelihood, if you're anything like Camouflage, is something that's probably very different from what you conceived of in the first place. And maybe it's bias or rose-colored glasses, but what you see when you're done, if you're lucky, that spirit of what you conceived of is still very much there. To me, that's the story of episode 2.
Episode 2 actually started off as our vertical slice, which means it's the first kind of ship quality environment, space, gameplay experiment that we did as a team. And so, yeah, episode 2 is a long time coming. We're talking over a year and a half ago we started this sucker.
And we spent probably about 3 months doing what you guys are going to see is known as like the museum now, which was like 3 rooms. I remember we would do these 2-minute demo videos, and the path was kind of that Hope would go through those 3 rooms, and we had some pillar-to-pillar kind of gameplay, and there was a garden counter, an event, and then it would end in a confinement room. And we would just go through and like polish that like 2 minutes of gameplay. And my job essentially every morning was to get here before the team and play through the build.
And in my opinion, it succeeded. I mean, it taught us everything we need to know from a shader standpoint, from a vert limit standpoint, from a designer like integration standpoint, how to work with designers for creating content.
We cut a lot of our tech on that level. We cut a lot of our young talent at the studio, a lot of myself included, kind of got their first experience in the games industry on episode 2.
Of course, later on, we added many, many more things. And this area, which at the time we thought was very much indicative in quality and polish of that final product, what we at the time thought was going to be this whole game, before we were episodic, before we were this huge project, that was only a tiny, tiny piece of what now is episode 2.
And now we can see that the team has gotten a lot better. They've learned how to work in Unity. They've learned about the platforms. They've just become better artists, better designers. And the audio is great on it too. So it's just awesome to see that through this space, as we keep refreshing it and getting it ready for ship over and over again, that the team has really grown, and the team is really matured, I feel like.
Once you walk into our first space, the library, you're going to see this huge grand reveal of this lobby. Obviously, hundreds of man hours have gone into this space, creating it, really refining the look and feel of that space to make you feel like this is an important moment.
It feels so quiet after hours. It used to be filled with books.
It also does a significant amount of storytelling and set dressing.
As you walk through it, it gets darker and darker. Like the interiors get darker, the lighting becomes more dim, it becomes more noirish and stuff. And I think that sort of parallels kind of Hope's awakening in episode 2. But I really, really like the contrast between this beautiful, sort of warmly lit, inviting environment and the really, truly awful stuff that we subject Hope to and that she has to witness.
For this episode, I feel we've got more of a focus on developing who Hope is, her character, as well as other characters that are in the Metamorphosis world.
So in episode 1, we had a lot of sort of setting up of a bunch of different chess pieces. We had Mireille, Derringer, the posthumous Zager, obviously Hope, and we see them only through like their very kind of specific lens in like a couple of scenes, and Hope in particular doesn't have a whole lot of personality.
Now she's in a much more immediate sense of danger. She's escaped interrogation. She's kind of on the run. She needs to go see the librarian, and I think the stakes are going to get a lot higher, a lot quicker.
For the very first time, the overseer or the headmaster is no longer just this voice that we're hearing over intercoms. He becomes a real person, and we see him, if only for brief glimpses, towards the end of episode 2. And he's sort of putting his minions to work. Things are being set in motion, and we're starting to gain a real sense of, and appreciation also of the conflicts that exist between these characters whom we were only introduced briefly to in the beginning of episode 1.
You know, Derringer, who we knew was kind of a hard ass maybe in episode 1, we actually see him murder another character, one of Hope's friends, and by showing that, I think, you know, we raised the stakes in a pretty significant way. At Camouflage, we sort of pride ourselves on having something like a flat structure. And it's allowed people in different departments to sort of to intermingle and work with other departments. And so, you know, I would write a cinematic and then get to work, you know, firsthand with Caitlin and Melissa and Kevin, the other animators, on sort of bringing these cinematics to life.
It's interesting because a lot of people feel like with motion capture that all the work is already done for you, everything's all laid out, there's very little to do, which is
not true at all.
Yeah, it's the complete opposite, because the computer doesn't really know what looks good. You still need that artistic eye to go in there and make things look really, really nice, really, really believable.
When you write a game script, as opposed to writing, you know, a movie script or a TV script, you know, all those sort of nuances that you want to get out of your characters, you've got to get in post. You know, you're not going to get them on set. You know, the actor will go and record the VO in a booth, and then you have to build the scene from that. Ideally with mocap, but if you don't have mocap, then you kind of have to, you know, start from scratch, and that's what Caitlin had to do in many cases with the cinematics in episode 2.
Well, episode 2, when we started, the spaces weren't actually finished. I mean, for some of the areas that we had to have the cinematics happen, they weren't even thought of, like thought out. There was nothing, there was kind of a general idea. And I'd have to go in Maya and kind of build, you know, a couple walls and maybe a doorway and be like, well, that's kind of what it might look like. Because I need something to base the characters around. So now that we get, you know, closer and the environment guys are building the actual scenes and all that stuff is happening, we're finding that sometimes the animations don't quite fit. And we have to go in and be really creative about how to get them to work.
Gave us an opportunity to build in all the subtleties of character performance that we wouldn't have gotten had we, you know, just filmed it or even mocapped it. All the little, you know, characters scratching their cheek or looking around the room while they're talking or whatever, make that meaningful and give us a story purpose to it, was one of the kind of the fun challenges of working with animation as a writer.
There's a magic to the games that I think Republic takes its influence from that maybe goes underappreciated. You know, people talk about 8-bit games or 16-bit games or whatever.
Episode 2 originally started off as our idea to bring back a lot of the things we loved about the 32-bit era and those games, those survival horror games, those weird like Sega Saturn games that were like really trying to struggle with 3D and interesting perspectives.
Just crude textures, pre-rendered backgrounds, that pastiche of like horror and stealth and sci-fi that kind of made itself like the standard in that era. I think that's something that's really special.
I feel like it really used to be in the 32-bit era that you'd have much more of a mix of puzzle in with the action, and it wasn't really an awkward thing. It was just kind of a fun sort of cooperative between the two. One thing we wanted to do with Republic is really reintroduce puzzle elements, just, you know, tying it into the universe, but also a little bit for the sake of just having kind of these puzzle elements in the experience.
It just brings me back to, you know, being in high school and, you know, loading up CDs and these like 32-bit consoles and just really seeing what they're trying to push in terms of, you know, audio fidelity, you know, visual fidelity, more of like a cinematic feel than any games had done previous. And I actually feel like that's what we've been doing on mobile. And it's kind of an interesting kind of redux when it comes to, you know, game development. I feel like we're kind of, in a way, pioneering what like 32-bit era, you know, designers and developers were doing back in the day.
Audio is something that plays like a huge role in Republic in general, but with episode 2, players are going to notice an immediate shift.
As for episode 2, because the space is so large, we wanted to try emphasizing on the actual style of music. So this time around, we are making use of classical music instead of electronic type music. So the music this time around, it is not only adjusting to the progression of where the player is at in the game, story-wise, but it is also being affected based on where your location is. Not just dependent on where Hope is located, but dependent on where the character is navigating throughout the space.
In most episodic games, I think what players expect is more of the same content. I think they definitely expect they're going to get new characters, new story, basically like bigger and better, but I don't think they're expecting the sort of content changes and new features that we're delivering with our episode 2.
Starting in episode 1, there was a lot of gameplay mechanics and features that we wanted to introduce the player to, and Hope just wasn't really the right vehicle for that at the time, so we offloaded a lot of the tutorialization and in some ways the connection to the character Cooper. But it's always been the vision for Republique to reinforce the relationship between the player and Hope. So in episode 2, now that the player's already got a good basis for knowing how to play the game, what to do, we can instead put Cooper more in a little bit more of a backseat position and instead let kind of Hope come out and be the person who, as you're experiencing new areas in the environment, that she's the one you're getting feedback from.
I think this is a replica of the train the headmaster was held prisoner on.
So pretty much in every way we could, we've rethought about how to invest the player back into Hope and making them understand it's more like a tennis match between the two of them rather than them just simply guiding her through.
These statues, their arrangement is curious.
Cooper is now kind of a help desk if you need him. He'll lay low, he'll stay quiet, but if you run into trouble and you're having difficulty solving a puzzle or you can't get Hope out of a room, then you can ring up Cooper and he'll offer some sage advice.
In searching for the librarian, remember, you have a map. Use it to check out areas you've visited.
On paper, I think the thing that got me really excited about episode 2 was that we were going to break up the linearity of the previous episode and give the players a lot more agency and have just a lot more exploratory into this big open environment where they can kind of just send Hope and work with her and unlock a lot of these mysteries that we've been integrating into the story, into the environment. And that's absolutely true. I think we've executed on that.
In episode 1, we had a very linear approach in terms of leading the player and character Hope through the spaces, and part of that is because it's in some ways the easiest approach to discovering what your gameplay is. You don't want to have too many variables. You just kind of want to keep the player on a very rigid path as you teach them what they need to know. Now that the player already knows how to play our game, in episode 2, in terms of space, we've gone in, I guess as far the opposite direction as we can.
If you're going to ask me like my one favorite feature about episode 2, it's that, and it kind of surprised me, but we had this idea of this roaming guard, like this new shock guard that would actually be impervious to Hope's taser attacks, but also be able to attack Hope and basically knock her out. And they're on these random patrol paths. So what ends up happening is that, by definition, I feel like stealth action games are oftentimes these kinds of calculated, almost methodical and mathematical gameplay encounters. But what these new shock guards do is that they're like these sequence breakers that just bring a huge random element into the environment and into the encounter and get players just nervous about, almost like in a survival horror game, where's the next zombie going to come from?
I think one of the things that we didn't anticipate that's actually turned out very much in our favor is having the ability to go through and take the things about episode 1 during the production of episode 2 that we didn't like and sort of adjust them and sort of retcon out things that we weren't happy with that we couldn't address because we didn't have the time.
We get to put out a contained piece of gameplay. We get all that feedback, not just from the critics, but more importantly from the players in terms of what they feel is really working and what's not. And then with episode 2, we get to not only do the things that we had intended, but we get to have a chance to revise how episode 2 is working, try something else, and then also actually release updates to the way episode 1 worked.
Design is always changing, everything's always changing. So nothing is ever set in place until the game's shipped. And so a lot of the work that we go in having to redo is for the better. And so although it could be frustrating at times, it's needed and necessary.
We're making all kinds of new decisions, adding new game objects to each of the levels. We're adding new features, new ways to interact with the world. And it's kind of all about this whole idea of the game as a constant living kind of service, and we're trying to like continually, add to it and modify it.
Each episode is on its own a little place inside a much larger place, and I think the ability of each episode to stand on its own is something that I think is going to set Republic apart from other episodic games in the future. So I'm really excited for the future of Republic, and what we have in store for episode 3 is going to be every bit as different from 2 as 2 was from 1. So I think that's something players have a lot to look forward to.